The smell of boiling noodles filled the kitchen, thick and heavy like a memory that refused to leave. I stood by the counter with a wooden spoon in my hand, staring at the water turning cloudy. The steam rose to my face, stinging my eyes a little, though I wasn't sure if it was the heat or the exhaustion that made them burn. Behind me, Noah scrolled through his phone, the glow of the screen cutting a pale light across his jaw. He didn't look up. He hadn't looked at me for days, maybe weeks. "Did you pay the electric bill this month?" I asked. Came out soft like a habit more than a question. For a moment I thought he didn't hear me. Then the air changed, sharp and tight, like someone had drawn invisible lines between us. He turned. The expression on his face was the same one he used to give his father when he thought he was being challenged. "Who cares who pays it?" he said flatly. Then louder, faster. "You don't even know how to pay a bill yourself. You want me to show you how to use a card? You can't even remember your own PIN half the time." I blinked. "I was only asking," I said. He laughed under his breath, that dry, bitter laugh that used to sound like a cough when he was a boy. "You're always asking. Always talking. About things that don't matter." He shook his head, then looked at his wife across the table. "See what I mean? She can't just sit and eat in peace." Elena didn't look up. She was slicing a piece of bread with perfect precision, the knife hitting the plate every few seconds with a crisp little sound. "She likes the drama," she said. "Some people get bored if everything's fine. She's been that way since I moved in." I didn't answer. I just kept stirring, though there was nothing left to stir. The pot hissed, the noodles clung together, and the smell turned bitter. It was the same kitchen where I once made birthday cakes shaped like dinosaurs for Noah when he was 5. The same table where we had pancakes and syrup every Sunday morning. The same walls where his drawings used to hang crooked with tape. Now they were covered with Elena's framed quotes about positive energy and boundaries. The silence stretched until it wasn't silence anymore. Just the sound of resentment breathing through the house. Noah's voice broke it. "You know what your problem is, Mom? You think this place still belongs to you. You walk around like you own it." I turned slowly, the spoon still in my hand. "Noah," I said, "I don't think anything belongs to me anymore." He smirked. "Good. Then you finally understand how things work around here." The way he said "around here" made it sound like a threat. I put the spoon down. The wooden handle clattered softly against the counter. My arm brushed the edge of the pot and I felt the warmth through my sleeve. He saw me glance down and rolled his eyes. "For God's sake, I'll do it," he muttered, stepping closer. He grabbed the pot with one hand, too fast, too careless. The boiling water tipped, spilling over the edge in a sudden silver arc. It hit my arm before I had time to move. The pain was instant and bright like lightning. I gasped, stumbling back, clutching my forearm. The towel slipped off the counter and hit the floor. "Jesus, Mom," he said. "Why did you stand so close?" Elena stood up, wine glass still in hand. "See? This is what happens. Every time. You push and then everyone ends up upset." I could barely hear them over the pulse in my ears. My skin screamed. I looked down at the red blooming across my arm. It was alive, throbbing, angry. "You should go cool that off," Noah said, his voice suddenly too calm. "Don't make it worse." I stared at him, at both of them, and for the first time in my life I realized they weren't ashamed. They were inconvenienced. I stepped backward slowly, the counter pressing against my spine like a wall holding me up. From the corner of the room a small voice spoke. "Grandma." Lily was sitting at the little table by the window, her fingers wrapped around a juice box, her eyes wide and still. She hadn't moved the whole time. I forced a smile. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling only at the edges. "Finish your drink." Noah sighed and turned away. Elena began cleaning up as if the scene had been nothing more than a broken plate. The spoon I dropped earlier rolled across the floor and stopped near Lily's foot. "Mom," Noah said without looking at me. "We're tired of this. The tension, the complaining. You've got a place to stay if you want to. Aunt Ruth still lives out in Lark Hollow, doesn't she? Maybe you should visit her for a while. Everyone could use a break." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal. I nodded slowly. "A break," I repeated. "Yes. Maybe that's what we all need." Then I walked to my room, holding my arm against my chest. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when the door clicked shut behind me, and the noise from the television started up again in the living room. Inside my room, everything was exactly as I left it. The floral quilt, the chipped lamp, the photo of Thomas on the dresser. His eyes in that picture still carried that same quiet patience I used to lean on. I sat on the bed, unrolled a clean towel, and pressed it gently to the burn. It hurt less when I didn't look. The pain was sharp, but it made something else inside me clearer. I'd built this house. I'd scrubbed its floors, paid its bills, repaired its roof, carried my husband through his last breath beneath it. Every inch of this place had once known my hands. And yet, here I was being told to leave like a guest who overstayed her welcome. The towel on my arm turned pink where the skin had broken. I stared at the stain until it blurred, until the line between pain and understanding faded. They wanted me gone. Maybe it was time to give them exactly that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the house breathe. Every sound was familiar but wrong. The creak of the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, even the soft click of the heating vent. They all belonged to someone else now. Somewhere in the distance, I heard Lily cough and Elena hush her back to sleep. I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between the noises. 3, 7, 12. The rhythm felt like time packing itself into small boxes, neat and final. At 2 in the morning I got up. The air was cold against my skin. I walked to the dresser and pulled out the small wooden box I hadn't touched in years. My fingers found the latch easily, as if they'd been waiting. Inside was the title deed, folded, creased, still bearing my name in black ink. Liberty Lyons. The sight of it steadied me. I could almost hear Thomas's voice then, gentle and sure, the way he sounded when he used to repair the porch steps. "Don't let them forget who built this," he used to say. "The day you forget, it stops being yours." I had forgotten. Until tonight. I sat for a long while holding that paper, feeling its edges against my skin. It wasn't about property. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering that I had built something once, and that it still existed even if the people inside it no longer saw me. At dawn I started packing. I didn't take much, just enough for a few days, though I already knew I wouldn't be coming back. A few shirts, a cardigan, the framed photo of Thomas, my worn Bible, and a paperback novel I never finished. I wrapped the title deed in an old scarf and placed it at the bottom of the bag. Outside, the first light of morning crept across the window. I could hear birds waking up, a sound that used to make me smile. I zipped the bag quietly, then turned to look around the room one last time. It looked smaller than I remembered, like a photograph shrinking with age. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The house smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. I could hear Noah in the living room talking to someone on the phone, his voice casual, unbothered. I walked past the kitchen. The pot from last night was still in the sink. The stain from the spilled water had dried into a dark shape on the floor. I paused, staring at it for a moment. It looked almost like a map, something marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. I slipped on my coat and shoes, picked up the bag and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. The street was quiet. No one saw me leave. The bus stop was 5 blocks away. I walked slowly, the cold air biting through my sleeves. My arm throbbed with every step, but I didn't mind the pain. It reminded me I was still here, still capable of moving forward. When the bus arrived, I climbed on and sat by the window. The driver nodded, asked where I was headed. "Lark Hollow," I said. He nodded again, punched the ticket, and the doors closed with a sigh. As the bus pulled away, I looked back once at the house. The curtains were drawn, the porch light still flickering from the storm last week that no one had bothered to fix. It used to be home. Now it was just a place I used to belong to. The town slipped by in soft blurs, storefronts, gas stations, early morning joggers. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. Not sad, just different. Like someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to leave. I rested my forehead against the glass and whispered, "You wanted me gone. So I'm gone." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded like truth. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. Somewhere beyond those hills lay Lark Hollow, the place where Thomas once promised we would grow old together. I didn't know what waited for me there. But for the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel like punishment. Felt like freedom. The bus hummed like a slow lullaby as it climbed out of town. Frost laced the grass along the roadside and the fields wore a thin silver sheen that made morning look expensive. I held my bag on my lap and kept one hand inside it, touching the folded scarf that hid the title deed. The paper felt both fragile and stubborn. It had edges that could prick you if you did not handle it with care. I liked that about it. It reminded me of myself. We passed the old feed store and the billboard with the peeling paint that once promised happiness in a bottle of cola. The letters had faded to ghosts, which seemed honest to me. I watched a plow kick up a neat line of earth and thought of Thomas with his steady hands, and his jokes delivered in a voice so gentle that even the punchlines felt like comfort. He used to say that the first thing you build with a hammer is your confidence. The second thing, if you are lucky, is a home. I closed my eyes and let the road roll through me. The burn on my arm throbbed beneath my sleeve in a slow tide. I pressed my sleeve to it and breathed until the pain softened. Pain is strange. It shrinks the world to a single point and then, if you keep breathing, it gives the world back to you piece by piece. Seat, window, light, hills, sky, me. At the first stop, a woman in a red coat got on with a paper bag that smelled like oranges. She sat across the aisle and kept looking at my hands. Maybe she thought I looked lost. Maybe she saw the little tremor I get when I am tired. She reached into her bag and rolled an orange across the empty seat toward me. It bumped gently against my coat. "You look like you could use something sweet," she said. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it with my whole chest. We sat there eating sections of orange like children. Juice clung to my fingers. The smell filled the space around us, and for a few minutes the bus did not feel like a place for leaving. It felt like a place for pausing. "Where are you headed, dear?" she asked. "Lark Hollow," I said. She nodded the way people do when they decide not to ask why. That was a kindness. Sometimes the door you need most is the one that stays closed. The bus let her off 2 towns later. She waved without speaking. I waved back and watched her red coat move down the sidewalk like a small lighthouse. Then the driver announced the transfer. I gathered my bag and stepped out into a wind that wore sharp teeth. The second bus was older and the seats sagged like they had secrets. I chose the window again. I always choose the window if I can. I do not like to watch people who are watching me. We drove past the river where Thomas and I used to fish when money was thinner than air. He would cast his line and say that hope is just patience dressed in daylight. We only ever caught little things, sunfish mostly. We let them go. We were too proud to eat our hope. The river today looked cold and quick. I pressed my warm palm to the glass and left a fog print there. Faded almost at once. Everything fades almost at once if you keep moving. I thought of the night Noah was born. I thought of the way he looked at me that first minute. Eyes squeezed shut, mouth open, furious at air itself. I sang to him then. He went quiet like a storm stepping off the porch. People talk about the first time a baby smiles as if that is when love begins. For me it began when he went quiet in my arms and decided the world would be allowed to keep turning. I wanted to hold on to that. For years I did. I held it so tightly I softened the edges and called them accidents. Words said in a rush. Days when he was stressed. A tone that he would fix tomorrow. Tomorrow came with perfect attendance and nothing else. A boy does not wake up cruel. Ruth told me once when we both were young nurses and thought wisdom could be practiced like hand washing. A boy learns cruelty by watching what is excused. I hated that sentence when she said it. It made me feel responsible for the sky. But I see what she meant now. Kindness keeps a house standing. But so does a line that cannot be crossed. I built one kind of wall and forgot the other. The driver turned on the radio and a soft country song pooled into the aisle. My head touched the window and the rhythm of the road ran up through my bones. I thought of my room at home and how small it had looked when I left. The quilt, the lamp, the photo. Leaving is not always the door. Sometimes it is the way you see the room in the minute before you close the door. That minute is the true departure. The rest is only travel. At a gas station stop the driver gave us 10 minutes. I got out and stood by the vending machines. A line of crows hopped near the ditch and talked in little quarrels. I let the wind scrape my face clean. Inside the station, a young cashier with chipped nail polish asked if I wanted ice for my arm. I told her I was fine. I was not, but fine is easier to carry than the truth when you have miles left. She gave me a small packet anyway and said no charge. I held it under my sleeve and felt the cold spread. Sometimes the world touches you with a fingertip and that is enough to keep you from falling. Back on the bus, I took the scarf wrap deed from my bag just to check it was still there. The scarf was one Thomas bought me at a roadside market the week we signed the mortgage. We ate corn dogs in the truck, and he told me that he loved how the scarf made my eyes look like lake water. That man could make a woman believe in ordinary magic. The scarf has little blue threads that catch the light. I tied it back carefully. My name on the paper felt like a bell that had been silent for years and was finally given a pull. The road narrowed to 2 lanes and the land changed its face. The houses stood farther apart and the trees gathered closer like old friends. We passed a shuttered motel with a sunburned sign and a chapel with a white bell tower that looked freshly painted. Lark Hollow always greeted you like a quiet aunt. No rush. No stare. Just space to catch your breath. Thomas once said the town was stitched together by borrowed sugar and shared ladders. He had a way of describing a place that made you see the kitchen behind the front door. By late morning the light had softened to a kind of patient silver. The bus eased onto Main Street and hissed to a stop. The driver turned in his seat and nodded at me as if he had been carrying me himself across the distance. "End of the line, ma'am." I thanked him with the kind of gratitude you give a bridge. The station was small, just 2 benches and a corkboard taped with flyers for guitar lessons, dog walkers, and a church bake sale. I sat for a minute and listened to the quiet. Cities hide their noise inside people. Small towns let their silence sit right on the surface where you can see it. I breathed in that silence until it became mine. Across the street a diner blinked its open sign. I crossed the road and pushed the door. A bell rang above me and a woman with hair the color of toast looked up from behind the counter. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, then took in my coat, my bag, my face. "You look like you want the corner by the window. That is a good place for new days." I smiled and sat where she pointed. She brought coffee and a glass of water without asking. "Milk and sugar," she said, and set both down like offerings. My hand shook when I reached for the cup. The first sip was almost holy. Heat moved through me and set 1,000 small things right. "The special today is meatloaf," the woman said. "Tastes like remembering." Then I was smiling for real. "Meatloaf, please," I said. "And could I get some ice too?" She brought a white bowl of ice and a napkin. Her eyes slid to the edge of my sleeve. I tucked the fabric higher and rested my arm on the cold. The relief made me close my eyes for a heartbeat. I heard her walk away without a sound. No questions. Another closed door I needed. I felt grateful to her in the way you feel grateful to a stranger who does not force you to explain your life before you have decided it yourself. I ate slowly and watched the street. A man on a bicycle coasted past carrying a loaf of bread under his arm. 2 girls in school uniforms shared a pair of earbuds and laughed at whatever they heard. A dog lay perfectly still in a square of sun, as if he were practicing the art of being exactly where he was. Lark Hollow was still the same patient aunt, it seemed. It waited for you to say something when you were ready. After lunch I asked the woman at the counter if there was a hardware store still open at the edge of town. She told me there was and drew a little map on the back of her receipt. Her lines were straight and quick. She added a tiny drawing of a house with a chimney, and then blushed for no reason I could see. "You can smell the cedar when you pass it," she said. "The owner sands wood in the afternoons. I always think the air there smells like a good ending." I paid and left her a thank you written on the napkin. Outside, the day had warmed enough to allow my coat to unbutton without complaint. I followed her little map and let the town show me where it had kept itself while I was away. The hardware store sat behind a row of elms that leaned in like a choir. She was right about the cedar. The smell wrapped me as I walked. Inside I bought a few things that make starting over feel like an action instead of a wish. A new lock. A small hammer. A box of nails. The man at the counter gave me a discount without telling me he was doing it. I told him to keep the change for the jar labeled Little League. He tipped his cap and I walked out holding a paper sack that made me feel taller. The sun had shifted to the west when I reached the road that would take me beyond the church and the feed store and out toward the edge of town. My feet knew the slope before my eyes remembered it. My breath fell into an old rhythm. I passed the cemetery where Thomas and I once read names aloud to each other, and made up kind lives for the ones whose stones had been worn smooth. We believed then that stories could keep people warm. I still believe that. Some fires you carry in your mouth so they can light someone else's dark. At the bend in the road the land opened to a shallow valley, and there it was in the near distance, small and tired and still standing. The little house we never finished. The porch missing a step. The screen door peeled back like a loose scab. The roof a patchwork of effort and weather. I stopped and felt my heart step forward as if it had been waiting at the threshold all these years. My hand found my bag and the scarf again. The title deed lay quiet under the blue fabric. Mine, the paper said without raising its voice. Mine. I kept walking until the deed and the house and the woman carrying both were finally in the same place again. The gate squeaked hello when I pushed it. In the grass a rusted mailbox leaned in a proud slant. Lions, the faded letters said. Almost gone. Not yet. I stood on the porch and let the wood speak to my weight. It held. It remembered. Inside me a small chair was pulled back from a small table, and a small hope sat down. I reached under the third flower pot without thinking. My fingers met a cool shape I knew better than I knew the lines on my palm. A key. Old and honest. It rested in my hand like a confession given and received. I did not put it in the lock yet. I just held it and listened to the wind run up the eaves like a child. Behind me the road kept going. Ahead of me the door waited. Between the two stood a woman whose name was still written on a piece of paper wrapped in a blue scarf in the bottom of her bag. I closed my hand around the key and let the house breathe with me. Then I stepped forward, steady as a promise I owed myself. The key slid into the lock with a sigh, as though the door had been waiting for me to come home. When it turned, a puff of air drifted out that smelled like cedar, old linen, and something sweeter that I couldn't quite name. Maybe dust, maybe memory. I pushed the door open. The room exhaled light in soft motes that floated above the furniture like slow snow. Everything was exactly where I remembered it should be and also entirely different. The table sat under the window, one leg braced with a folded magazine. The curtains drooped in tired folds. The sink gleamed faintly beneath a layer of dust. And in the far corner, the small rocking chair Thomas had built for me waited with its back to the wall. My throat tightened. I set my bag down and touched the chair's worn armrest. The wood was smooth where my hand had always rested, rough where his tools had left their small imperfections. I pressed my palm against it and whispered his name. For a moment I thought I heard the faint echo of his laugh moving through the boards. I walked slowly through the rooms, fingers tracing the edges of everything. The house had a heartbeat. The floors creaked like old knees, the windows hummed softly when the wind shifted. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. This was the place we meant to finish one summer and never did. We had promised ourselves a porch swing and a garden full of marigolds. He used to say marigolds looked like houses smiling. I found the old kettle on the stove and filled it with water from the tap. The pipes coughed twice before surrendering a thin, steady stream. I turned the burner on and waited until the whistle rose, high and clear. The sound made me laugh quietly. After all this time, the little house could still sing. I took my tea to the small bedroom and sat on the bed. The mattress sagged, but the shape felt familiar. When I closed my eyes, I could see Thomas lying beside me, reading by the light of a lamp that buzzed like a fly. He always fell asleep mid-sentence. I used to slide the book out of his hands and mark the page with a receipt or a grocery list. I never told him how much I liked those tiny pauses between his breathing and the sound of the crickets outside. Now the only breathing in the room was mine. I pulled the scarf from my bag and unfolded the title deed. The paper was yellowed, but my name still marched across it in clear black ink. Liberty Lyons. I traced each letter until it felt like a pulse under my finger. All these years I had let my son believe this house belonged to him because he lived in it. I had confused generosity with surrender. I had mistaken silence for peace. I laid the paper on the bedspread and stared at it until the words blurred. Then I said aloud to no one and to everyone, "This is still mine." The sentence didn't sound defiant. It sounded honest, like something that had been hiding behind my ribs waiting to be released. Outside, a car passed down the road and its headlights swept briefly across the window. In that brief light, the burn on my arm glowed pale and new. It looked like a promise branded into skin. A mark that said I had survived something hot enough to change shape but not enough to erase me. I gathered the few things I had unpacked and put them neatly in the dresser drawers. In the kitchen I washed the mug, the spoon, and the kettle. The water ran clear. I lit a single lamp and left it glowing in the front room so the house wouldn't feel alone. Before lying down, I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool and wet, carrying the faint scent of pine. Across the road, fireflies blinked in the field. They rose and fell like slow breathing. Somewhere a dog barked once and then stopped, as if he had changed his mind. I closed my eyes and listened. No shouting, no footsteps, no television bleeding through the walls. Only the quiet rhythm of a place remembering me. I whispered into the dark. You wanted me gone, Noah. So I left. But I didn't leave empty-handed. When I turned back inside, the lamp's light fell across the deed still lying on the bed. The edges fluttered slightly in the draft. I tucked it back into its box and slid it under the bed frame. The wood beneath gave a little sigh like it approved. That night I dreamed of Thomas standing in the doorway, the same young man who once carried planks on his shoulder and smelled of sawdust and soap. He looked at me and said, "You kept it safe." I wanted to tell him I hadn't, not really, but he smiled in that quiet way of his, the smile that forgave before you confessed. When I woke, sunlight filled the room. It fell across the quilt, across my arm, across the space where Thomas had stood in the dream. I got up and opened the window. The air tasted of rain and fresh beginnings. I boiled water again, made tea, and sat by the window with both hands around the cup. Across the lane, a woman was tending roses by her fence. She straightened, squinting toward the house, then waved. "Liberty," she called. My heart skipped. "Ellie." She laughed, bright and surprised. "Lord above, it is you. I thought you'd vanished. Come over for supper later, you hear? I still make that peach cobbler you loved." "I will," I said, my voice catching. "I promise." She nodded and went back to her roses. I sat watching her for a long time, the tea cooling in my hands. For the first time in years, someone had said my name with warmth. It rolled through me like sunlight across water. When I looked down at the deed again, the ink seemed darker, stronger. This was not running away. This was a return. A beginning disguised as an ending. And somewhere deep inside, the woman I used to be, the builder, the nurse, the wife, the mother, stirred and stood up. I said to the empty room, "I remember who I am now." The house, polite as ever, answered with a single creak in the floorboards, as if it were saying welcome home. By afternoon the town had settled into that quiet hum I always loved. Lark Hollow never tried to impress you. It just kept on being itself, steady as a clock that knows the time without boasting. I swept the front room until the dust rose like a soft little storm, then opened both windows and let the breeze decide what to carry and what to leave. The smell of cedar met the smell of wet leaves, and for a moment the house felt like a chest you open at last and find your own breath inside. Ellie came over with a basket on her arm and a grin that took 10 years off her face. She set the basket on the table and pulled out bread still warm under a towel, a jar of blackberry jam, and a small tin of butter that looked like sunlight. She hugged me and then studied my face like a careful nurse. Her eyes drifted to my sleeve where the skin on my arm peeked out pink and raw. "You tell me the truth," she said softly. "Are you safe now?" I nodded. The nod did not need to hide anything. "I am safe here." "Good," she said. "Then let us feed that safety until it puts on some weight." She spread butter on thick slices and kept talking the way old friends do when they want to cover you with words until you stop shaking. She told me about her beagle who sleeps like he is proud of it. She told me about the church choir that has only 2 altos and sings like there are 12. She told me about Mrs. Pike who bakes pies for funerals and weddings with the same recipe, because grief and joy both need a crust that holds. We ate with our fingers sticky from jam. I wanted to tell her everything, but my throat felt full of string. I gave parts of the story in careful pieces and watched the way her mouth pressed into a line when I mentioned the kitchen and the pot and the water that found my skin. She reached across the table and rested her hand near mine without quite touching. I felt the warmth of it like a small fire that accepted company. "Stay here as long as you like," she said. "I will not meddle. But I will not let you be alone either." "Thank you," I said. The words were small compared to the shape of what I meant, but they were what I had and they were honest. After Ellie left, I walked the rooms again with a rag and a bowl of soapy water. I wiped the windowsills and the backs of chairs. The rag turned gray and the wood began to show its old grain. Work is a good instrument for calming the mind. It holds your hand still so your heart can speak up. By the time the light began to lean toward evening, I had found a rhythm that sounded like my name. I took the rug from the bedroom and beat it on the clothesline until dust made a private galaxy around me. Stars of lint, planets of old pollen. A little universe that did not mind being undone. When I went back inside, I caught sight of myself in the glass of the curio case. I looked older than I felt, and calmer than I expected. The bruise of the last week had not left my face, but the outline of the woman underneath was coming forward again. Builder. Nurse. Wife. Mother. I let each word sit on my tongue and I did not spit any of them out. Close to dusk I walked the path behind the cottage that bends around to a small rise where you can see a ribbon of road and the spire of the chapel. Thomas and I used to stand there and make plans with our eyes. We would point to where the garden would go and where the porch swing would hang and which tree would be the first to turn red in October. I spoke to him aloud because why not, and told him I was back and that the door obeyed the key like a loyal memory. I told him I had slept without fear. The wind lifted as if in answer and ran its hand through the grass. That felt like enough of a reply. On the way back I cut through the yard of a house that used to belong to a quiet couple who moved away when their boy got a job in the city. A cat watched me from the porch rail with the bored authority of someone who has seen many human dramas and keeps a score that means nothing. I saluted the cat. The cat blinked. We understood each other. Inside, I set water to boil for tea and opened the small cupboard that sits under the stairs. It holds the kind of things houses collect when no one is watching. A jar of screws. A chip saucer with a faded blue margin. A roll of twine that used to be Thomas's favorite tool because it is useful for more things than it pretends. Tucked behind the twine was a brittle envelope addressed to us in the careful hand of a woman from the county office who always wore brooches shaped like birds. She had mailed us a welcome when we first bought the place. The stamp showed a flag caught in a wind that was always happening. I ran my finger over the paper and smiled at how practical the past can be. I carried the envelope to the table and set it beside my notebook. Then I took the kettle off the heat and poured tea. The steam wrote a little sermon on patience against my face. I opened the notebook and wrote a list in dark ink with round letters that looked like they trusted themselves. Things to fix. Curtains. Front step. Weather strip the door. Replace the screws on the porch railing. I wrote a second list under it. Things to remember. Sleep. Breathe. Ice for the arm. Call Lily when I know what to say. Do not apologize for healing. Do not apologize for leaving. As the tea cooled, the house shifted the way houses do when they relax into evening. The lamp made a wide circle of soft gold on the walls. I set the brittle envelope back in the cupboard and wiped the counters one more time for the comfort of it. Then I went to the bedroom and pulled out the old cedar wardrobe from the wall a few inches so I could sweep behind it. The smell of the wood rose up, deep and clean, and pulled me backward through years. I could see Thomas lining those boards with paper. His tongue caught between his teeth in that way he had when he wanted the edges to match perfectly. As I swept, the broom caught on something that clinked against the floor. I knelt and reached under until my fingers closed on a box corner. The box was small and wooden with a simple brass latch. It looked like the kind of box a person uses for practical treasure. I sat on the floor with the broom still in my lap, set the box beside me, and felt a ripple of something like caution and hope holding hands. I did not open it. Not yet. I wanted the moment to breathe before I named it. Instead, I stood and finished the sweeping. I returned the wardrobe to the wall and folded the blanket at the foot of the bed in strict thirds the way my mother taught me when I was 10 and determined to do life neatly. The burn on my arm buzzed with a mild ache that felt like a weather report. I touched it to remind myself that pain can report without deciding the day. Then I carried the box to the front room and placed it on the table. I made fresh tea. I turned up the lamp. I looked out the window where evening was collecting itself in blue layers. When I felt ready, I lifted the latch. Inside lay ordinary marvels. A ring of keys, each labeled in the patient scrawl of my younger self. Shed. Back gate. Cellar. Bedroom window. There was a small roll of receipts tied with string. There were 2 photographs tucked face to face. In one, Thomas leaned against the porch post with sawdust in his hair, and a look that said he could build a future from a pile of boards if necessary. In the other, I was standing in the doorway of this very room with paint on my cheek, and a grin like a challenge. I touched each photo at the corner where the paper is strongest. Under the keys and the pictures was a folder. Inside the folder were papers I recognized at once because I had filed them once with neat satisfaction. inspection forms, tax letters, a maintenance list dated in my hand from a summer when we replaced the gutters and argued happily about gutter guards. At the very back was a business card for Ruth Bennett with a number written by her in steady ink, and the words "Call me if you ever need a witness." Beneath that, a second card with the county clerk's name. I held both like a person holds a map when the sun has nearly set. I did not cry. I felt a stillness that was stronger than tears. It was the kind of stillness that comes when the ground under your feet stops pretending and tells you exactly what it is. I put the keys on a ring and slid them into my pocket. I placed the folder in the cedar wardrobe where it would be easy to reach. I left the business cards on the table and set a book over them as if they were seeds and I wanted them to rest under a thin layer before sprouting. Then I blew out the lamp and stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time as the dark gathered itself without hurry. Sleep came like a careful guest. I woke once in the night when rain began to write its private language on the roof. I listened as if the house were reading aloud. Sounded like approval. It sounded like a plan drawing itself in the margins. Morning smelled like coffee and wet earth. I boiled water and sliced the last of the bread and ate it with a stripe of jam while standing at the sink. After breakfast I put on my coat and walked to Ellie's with the empty basket and a thank you that I practiced all the way there so that it would be large enough. Her beagle came charging to the fence with the ferocity of a pillow. Ellie waved me inside and made me sit while she poured coffee that tasted like friendship. She asked no questions and I offered a few answers. We talked about tomatoes. We talked about the post office clerk who can guess postage by sight. We talked about the weather on the news and the weather in our bones and agreed that the bones are usually right. On my way back I stopped at the chapel and sat in the last pew because I have always liked the permission the back row gives you to leave when you need to. The sanctuary smelled faintly of wax and old wood and 100 quiet wishes. I closed my eyes and let my hands rest open on my lap. I did not ask for anything. I offered a thank you for the kind of day that lets a woman breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. I returned to the house and swept the porch. I tightened one loose screw on the railing. I washed the front window until the glass forgot about time. When I stepped back I could see my reflection and the world beyond it at once. A woman and a town and a road that goes somewhere. I liked that composition. By noon I had a small stew simmering and a list of errands for tomorrow. Laundry. Weather stripping. A call to the clinic to ask about salve for burns because stubbornness is not medicine. I ate at the table with the window open a few inches. The air tasted like clean metal and rain. The quiet sat with me and did not need to be entertained. I looked at the book I had left over the business cards. I moved it to the side. I ran my thumb over Ruth's name. I did not pick up the phone. Not yet. I needed one more day to live inside the sound of my own decision, before I invited another voice to share it. I pressed the cards flat under my palm and felt the edges. Then I slipped them into the wooden box and closed the latch with a soft click that sounded like a promise. I stood, rinsed my bowl, and dried it with the towel Ellie had tucked into the basket as if she knew I would not think to bring one. When the afternoon grew long, I went back to the rise behind the house and watched clouds collect like careful sheep. Somewhere beyond those clouds a line was waiting to be crossed. Somewhere inside this house a door was waiting to be opened with more than a key. I felt both truths settle on my shoulders like a shawl. I went inside and lit the lamp before dark. The light made a small circle that felt sufficient. I set the notebook on the table and wrote a single sentence in the center of the page so it would have room to deepen. Tomorrow I will make a call. The house answered with that friendly creak again, as if it had learned my language and wanted to speak it back to me. I breathed out. The night came in. The quiet held. And for the first time since I stepped on that bus, I was not only safe. I was steady. The next morning began with the gentle insistence of rain. It pattered on the roof like someone knocking softly, asking permission to enter. I made coffee and stood by the window watching droplets race each other down the glass. The world outside was muted and silver. The kind of day that invites you to slow down and listen to the sound of your own thoughts. I carried my cup to the front porch. The steps groaned under my weight but held firm. From here I could see the road curving past the feed store and the chapel, disappearing into fog. The air smelled like wet wood and clean beginnings. A bird shook water off a branch and started to sing, bold against the quiet. It reminded me that even small voices can fill an entire space when nothing tries to drown them out. By mid-morning the rain eased. leaving a fine mist that clung to the trees. I decided to walk into town to pick up a few things. The hardware store owner, a man with kind eyes behind smudged glasses, recognized me before I introduced myself. "You're the woman who bought the Lion's place," he said. "Your husband was quite the craftsman. Built half that porch with my lumber, if I recall." I smiled. "He did. I still have the hammer marks to prove it." He chuckled and handed me a bundle of nails on the house. "For the next chapter," he said simply. I thanked him and left feeling seen, not like a ghost returning, but like a woman whose absence had been noted in gentle silence. Outside, the sky was opening its color again, a hesitant blue stretching between clouds. I walked to the general store and bought bread, salt, a jar of local honey, and a small notebook with a maroon cover. The cashier, a girl barely older than Lily, asked if I wanted a bag. I told her no, I preferred to carry things in my hands. She smiled in that polite way of young people who sense an older person's oddness but respect it. On the walk home I passed the old school building, now boarded up, the swing set out front wrapped in vines. I remembered standing there with Thomas once, laughing as Noah tried to push himself higher than the bar. His feet had reached the sky that day, and I had clapped until my palms tingled. I wondered where that child had gone, the one who used to giggle when I chased him around this very field. The wind blew through the vines and they moved just enough to make the swings creak, like the sound of old Joy trying to breathe. Back at the cottage, I set my things on the table and opened the notebook. On the first page, I wrote in slow, deliberate letters, "This is where I begin again." The next few hours passed in quiet work. I fixed the loose hinge on the back door. I wiped the kitchen shelves and lined them with paper. I mended a torn curtain using thread I found in a tin marked, "For emergencies." When I was done, I stood in the middle of the room and listened to the soft sounds of my labor echoing back. The faint creak of the boards, the rustle of fabric, the sigh of the wind through the chimney. Every noise was a confirmation. "You are here, you are doing, you are alive." As the afternoon deepened, Ellie came by again, this time with her old beagle trailing behind. She carried a small tin box under her arm. "Thought you could use some comfort," she said. Inside were 2 slices of peach cobbler, golden and fragrant. We ate on the porch. The beagle slept between us, twitching in his dreams. Ellie told me about her late husband, how she still talked to him in the garden when no one was looking. "People think grief fades," she said. "But really it just changes its outfit." I laughed softly. "That sounds like something Thomas would have said." "He was a good one," she replied, and there was no pity in her tone, just recognition. When the sun dipped behind the trees, Ellie left with a promise to visit again soon. I stayed outside, watching the light fade over the hills. A soft chill settled in the air, and I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. The house behind me glowed with the single lamp I had left burning inside. It looked small but sturdy, a quiet sentinel standing watch over the woman who had returned to claim it. As I sat there, my eyes drifted to the edge of the porch where the boards met the ground. I noticed a faint line carved into the wood, barely visible under the layers of dust. I leaned closer and brushed it clean with my fingers. There, etched in Thomas's careful hand, were 3 words: "For our freedom." I sat back, the breath leaving me all at once. He had carved it the summer before he fell sick, the same week we had talked about finishing the porch swing. I remembered laughing at him then, saying we didn't need to name a house as if it were a ship. He had only smiled and said, "Every home deserves a reason." Now, years later, his reason waited quietly under my fingertips. I ran my hand along the carving and whispered, "I found it, love. You built it right where I could see it when I was ready." The twilight deepened. Fireflies began their patient blinking, small lanterns rising from the grass. I thought about Noah then, not the man who shouted, but the boy who used to chase fireflies and cup them gently in his palms. I wondered if he ever paused long enough now to see the light they carried. Maybe one day he would. Maybe not. But I couldn't live waiting for that kind of maybes anymore. When darkness finally folded itself around the house, I went inside. The warmth of the lamp followed me down the hall. I pulled the title deed from under the bed and laid it on the table again. My name looked less like ink now and more like a doorway. I thought about all the years I had let that doorway stay closed out of politeness, out of habit, out of hope that someone else would remember I belonged. I reached for the maroon notebook and wrote on the second page. They wanted me gone, but I came back to the only place that ever had my name on the door. Then I closed the book and pressed my palm flat against it. The paper was warm from my hand. Before going to bed, I placed a candle on the windowsill and lit it. The flame wavered, then steadied, casting a golden thread through the glass into the dark. It wasn't for prayer or ceremony. It was a signal, small but certain. Someone lives here again. Someone remembers. I lay down and listened to the soft ticking of the clock on the dresser. The rhythm of it folded neatly into the beat of my heart. Outside, the wind shifted. The house sighed, content. I closed my eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring more fixing, more quiet work, and maybe, if courage stayed with me, a phone call to Ruth Bennett. But for tonight there was only this. The comfort of a house breathing with me, the faint echo of Thomas's carved words under my feet, and the steady truth that I was no longer running, I was rebuilding. And that, I thought as I drifted into sleep, is a better kind of freedom than I ever dared to imagine. The morning came dressed in light. It fell through the curtains in wide, clean stripes, as though the world had been polished overnight. I stood at the sink washing the single cup I had used for coffee and watched the sunlight crawl across the floorboards. It touched everything softly. My shoes by the door, the maroon notebook on the table, even the faded curtains that I had mended yesterday. For the first time in a long time, the morning did not feel like a burden to carry. It felt like a visitor that had come to keep me company. I dried my hands, picked up the phone, and stared at the card I had placed beside it. Ruth Bennett, attorney at law. The ink had faded, but her name was still written in that patient, upright way I remembered from our nursing days. Ruth always wrote as if her words could hold a person steady. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the dial. The thought of hearing her voice again filled me with a strange mix of comfort and fear. Comfort because she had always spoken truth like a surgeon, clean, efficient, merciful. Fear because she might ask questions I wasn't ready to answer aloud. The phone rang twice before I heard her voice. Bennett Law Office. Ruth, I said, my throat tightening. It's Liberty. There was a pause. I could almost hear her smile forming through the receiver. Well, I'll be damned, she said gently. I was wondering when you'd remember my card. I laughed quietly, though it sounded more like breathing. I didn't forget. I just wasn't brave enough until now. Then you're right on time, she said. Courage never runs late. Her words loosened something inside me. I told her about leaving the house in town, about Noah, about the water, and the silence that came after. I didn't embellish or defend. I just told the truth the way one might unpack groceries, plainly, one thing after another, until the table was full. Ruth listened the way she always had. Without interruption, without surprise, without pity. When I finished, she said quietly, You still have the deed, don't you? Yes. And it's in your name? Yes. Then you have nothing to fear but habit, Liberty. Her tone was so certain that I had to sit down. Habit? Yes. The habit of thinking that surviving is the same as living. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so I did both. Ruth let me. When the storm inside me quieted, she said, I'll come to you tomorrow morning. We'll go over everything together. No rush, no panic, no shame. Just facts. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me yet, she said with a soft chuckle. Wait until we win. After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone. The word win echoed in my chest, strange and almost frightening. I had never thought of my life in terms of winning or losing. I had only thought of it as enduring. But maybe endurance, after all, was only the prelude to victory. I spent the rest of the morning preparing the house as if I were expecting a guest of honor, which, in truth, I was. I dusted the shelves, brewed tea, and laid out a small plate of shortbread cookies I found tucked behind a jar in the cupboard. I even picked a handful of marigolds that had somehow sprouted wild by the fence. Their orange faces looked like sparks against the green. By the time Ruth arrived, the sun had climbed high, and the air outside shimmered with warmth. She stepped out of her car in her usual beige trench coat, a folder tucked under one arm, and an expression that blended concern with purpose. Well, she said as she approached, you don't look broken. That's a good start. I'm better than broken, I said. I'm awake. Ruth smiled. Then let's stay that way. Inside, she sat at the table and opened her folder with the same precision she once used when setting a broken bone. We'll start simple, she said. We establish ownership, evidence of neglect or abuse, and your right to reclaim the property. You've got the deed and the injury to prove it. The rest is narrative. Storytelling, I said, almost amused. Exactly, Ruth replied. And you've always been good at that. Her confidence steadied me. I handed her the deed, and she held it up to the light like it was something sacred. Still your name, she murmured, tracing the letters. Still standing. I nodded. Like the house. We spent hours at that table going through documents, receipts, photographs. Ruth took notes in neat, slanted handwriting. When she asked about Noah, her voice was careful, almost tender. I told her enough for her to understand but not enough to drown in it. At one point she looked up from her notes and said, "You know, the law is like a furnace. It burns away excuses until only truth is left. But you need to be ready for the heat." "I already know what it feels like to burn," I said quietly, glancing at the faint scar on my arm. Her gaze softened. "Then you'll handle it just fine." When she left, the folder of papers was lighter, but the air in the room felt heavier, thick with the weight of what was coming. The afternoon light had turned the color of honey. I stood at the window watching Ruth's car disappear down the road, and felt both brave and terrified at once. Later, as I washed the teacups, I caught sight of my reflection in the window pane. My face looked tired but alive. The woman staring back at me was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was preparing to stand. That evening, I sat on the porch with the maroon notebook and wrote, "Tomorrow begins the reckoning." But not out of anger, out of respect. For myself. For what was built. For what will be built again. As I closed the notebook, I heard thunder rumbling far off, low and deliberate, like the earth clearing its throat before it speaks. The first drop of rain hit the railing, then another, then many. I didn't go inside. I sat and let the rain find me. It ran through my hair, down my scar, across my hands, and into the boards beneath my feet. It was cold and clean and alive. When lightning flashed across the sky, for a moment it lit up the marigolds by the fence. They gleamed like tiny suns in the storm. I whispered to the night, "Let it come." And the house, strong and patient, whispered back through the rain, "I will hold." Ruth arrived the next morning before the kettle boiled. She stepped in, shook the rain from her coat, and spread papers across the table with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent a lifetime putting broken things where they belong. The room smelled like coffee and damp wool, and a thin thread of cedar that rose from the old wardrobe whenever the air turned wet. "Today we file," she said. "Nothing dramatic. Just signatures, stamps, and a clerk who has seen everything." I nodded. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. There is a calm that comes when you have finally named the thing you are doing. I poured coffee into 2 cups and set the sugar near her right hand because she always took 2 spoons when we were young and never learned to like it any other way. We went through the packet 1 page at a time. Ownership affidavit. Photographs of the burn. List of incidents with dates and brief descriptions. A simple statement in my own handwriting that said only this: "I am the legal owner of the property. I left due to safety concerns. I am returning now. I will protect what is mine." "Short is best," Ruth said, tapping the paper. "Judges like clean lines." When she placed the deed beside the affidavit, something shifted inside me. It was not triumph. It was not anger. It was a small unlocking. The hinge of a door that had rusted with years of politeness and wishful thinking had finally moved under its own purpose. By mid-morning we were at the county building. The lobby was all echo and old tile, the walls lined with bulletin boards announcing tax deadlines and lost pets with hopeful eyes. Ruth walked like a compass. I followed with my hands clasped behind my back to keep them from touching the edges of this new life, as if it were breakable. At the clerk's window, a woman with silver hair and a sweater the color of fog looked up, read my name on the first page, then looked back at me with an expression that held neither judgment nor surprise. She had the gaze of someone who learned long ago that the world keeps offering the same stories with different names. "Need to record a filing and request service," Ruth said. The clerk nodded. She stamped the first page with a sound that felt like a gavel softened by a pillow. Paper moved from one pile to the next. A date was written in a neat square. A number appeared in the corner like a small ceremony. I signed where Ruth pointed. She signed where the law required. The clerk slid a copy across to me and said, "You will receive confirmation of service within 48 hours. Keep your phone on." Her voice was kind but procedural. It was strangely comforting to be handled like a normal case. Pain always insists it is singular. The law reminds you that you are not the first and will not be the last. There is a lane for your feet. Walk it. Outside, the day had brightened. Ruth and I stood on the courthouse steps and let the sunlight warm our coats. She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who has crossed a difficult bridge. "You did the hard part," she said. "I only signed my name," I answered. "That is always the hard part," she said and smiled. We drove back to the cottage in an easy quiet. Ruth asked if she could see the house in town when the time came. I told her I would not step inside it again. She nodded as if she had expected that. "We do not have to walk back through every room to turn off the lights," she said. "Sometimes the switch is at the street." At the house we ate sandwiches I made from bread and honey and slices of sharp cheese that Ellie had left on my porch at dawn. Ruth sat with her elbows on the table and read aloud the formal language from the last page so I could feel its weight in my ears. The petitioner retains sole legal ownership of the property. The occupants have no lease agreement. The petitioner seeks immediate recovery of possession due to safety concerns and documented harm. She put the paper down and looked at me. "You are not cruel," she said. "Say it with me." "I am not cruel," I repeated. "You are consistent," she said. "I am consistent." "You are choosing safety." "I am choosing safety." We said it like liturgy until the words fit without pinching. When she left, the house felt larger. I moved through the rooms with a kind of deliberate care, touching the backs of chairs, straightening the stack of plates, opening and closing the back door to listen to its hinge. Then I carried a small table onto the porch and set it near the rail. I arranged the marigolds in a jar and placed them there so the house would have a bright eye to look through toward the road. The afternoon went by in soft chores. I oiled the wardrobe hinges. I wrote to Lillian a letter I did not plan to mail yet. I told her about the way fireflies wave in this town like old friends and how the wind on the ridge sounds like breath. I did not tell her about the kitchen or the pot or the words that fell like stones. Children carry enough stones when they are small. They do not need to borrow ours. Near evening my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The voice identified himself as Deputy Keller from the county sheriff's office. He spoke gently but clearly. Service would be attempted at the address tomorrow morning. If no one answered, a second attempt would follow. He explained the steps as if he were describing the stages of a storm. First the clouds, then the wind, then the rain, and finally the clean air left behind. "Do you want to be present?" he asked. "No," I said. "I know what it will look like without watching it happen." "I understand," he said. "I will call to confirm." After we hung up, I walked outside and stood at the foot of the porch stairs. The sky was the color of a bruise healing, deep purple giving way to blue. I could smell someone's supper carried thinly on the air. It made me think of all the dinners I had cooked in that other kitchen, the ones nobody thanked me for, the ones I still tasted in memory because the seasoning had always been patience. I sat on the porch step and whispered to the empty road, "Let it be clean." I did not mean painless. I meant lawful and simple and without extra harm. The kind of ending that leaves just enough room for whatever beginning might someday want to stand near it. The night came quietly. I wrote one line in the maroon notebook before bed. When the law is the fire, it burns the lies first. I slept lightly and woke before dawn to a sky that looked rinsed. The air felt new. I made coffee and took it outside. A thin mist lay across the field. It looked like a sheet someone had shaken out over the grass. Birds broke it with quick stitches of sound. At 9:17 the phone rang. Deputy Keller again. His voice carried the careful tone of news delivered without decoration. "Service completed," he said. "Both occupants received the notice. They have 5 days to vacate. If they resist, we proceed through the court order. You will be notified of each step." "Thank you," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to a woman who had been ready for this sentence years ago. He paused as if choosing whether to step 1 inch closer. "Ma'am," he said, "for what it is worth, I am sorry for what brought you here." I felt something small break and drift away, like ash lifting from a log when the flame changes shape. "Thank you," I said again. "I am not." After the call I did not cry. I stood on the porch with both hands around my cup and watched the mist lift. The world below it was what it had been yesterday. Trees, road, the crooked fence near the ditch. But the air had changed. Breath went in and came out without snagging on anything. Around noon the phone rang again. Noah. His name on the screen was a bruise that did not hurt. I let it ring twice and then answered. For a moment there was nothing but air. Then his voice came through, scrambled by panic and pride. Mom, what is this? You cannot be serious. They came to the door with papers. Elena is losing it. We have nowhere to go. I said nothing. The silence gathered shape between us. Mom, listen, he said, his voice dropping. We can talk. You do not have to do this. We were stressed. Things got too loud. It was an accident. You know I would never hurt you. Not on purpose. The skin on my arm pulsed in quiet memory. I took a breath and held it until my chest found its natural pace again. The paper has my name on it, I said. The house does too. He went quiet. Then the pleading shifted to anger and back again. He moved through the old choreography of a man who believes his feelings outrank a fact. I let the words pass without catching them. When he ran out of steps, I said, You have 5 days. He started to speak. I ended the call. I did not feel cruel. I felt accurate. The rest of the day behaved like any other. The sun crossed the sky. The kettle sang and stopped. Ellie brought over tomatoes and listened without reaching to fix what had never been hers to mend. I wrote 3 more sentences in the notebook and underlined one of them twice. I do not owe my silence to the people who broke it. At dusk I took the box of keys from the wooden chest and went outside. I tried each lock on the shed, the cellar, the back gate. Most still worked. One refused. I put a ribbon around it and made a note to replace it. Practical progress has a way of keeping a person from dissolving under the weight of a day. When night fell, I lit a candle on the porch rail and watched the moths circle it with the kind of reverence I used to think only belongs to churches. Somewhere in the distance a train blew a low note that sounded exactly like leaving and exactly like arriving. Before bed I placed the deed on the table and set a small smooth stone on one corner to keep the air from turning it. Thomas had picked that stone up at the river the summer we learned the names of all the birds that nested in the tall elms. He said a smooth stone is proof that persistence can be kind. I stood there with my hand on the paper, feeling its quiet authority. The house breathed around me. The night settled on the roof. Inside my chest a door swung on its new hinge without complaint. Tomorrow would start the count. Today had already given me what I needed. The law was written. The fire had its purpose. And I, at last, had mine. The morning after the deputy's call began without sound. Even the birds seemed hesitant to disturb it. I woke before the sun, when the world is the color of unpolished metal, and sat by the window with a cup of coffee that steamed in thin white threads. The sky at that hour felt like paper that had not yet decided what story it wanted to tell. I told myself I would not count the days. I would simply live them. But of course I did. Day 1. Ruth called shortly after 8. Her voice, as always, was precise and clean. They've been served, she said, though I already knew. Expect the noise to start now. What kind of noise? The kind people make when consequences arrive, she said. It will sound like regret, anger, apology, sometimes all at once. It's not your job to separate them. Just let it pass. I thanked her, though the word felt too small. She promised to call again in the evening, then hung up before I could say more. That was Ruth's way. Leaving space for you to fill with your own strength. I walked out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to bite my cheeks. Down in the field, fog moved low and heavy, rolling like something alive. The world smelled of soil and damp wood. My breath came out white and vanished. Everything about the morning felt temporary and honest. I spent the next few hours doing small things. Boiling water for tea. Folding the towels I had washed the night before. Writing in my maroon notebook in uneven lines. Freedom begins quietly. Around noon the phone rang again. It was a local number, one I didn't recognize. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Mom. The voice came cracked and uneven but unmistakable. Noah. I said nothing. Mom, please, he began. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Elena, she's been crying all night. The deputy said we have to leave. 5 days, Mom. 5 days. I stared out the window at the fog dissolving over the grass. My voice when it came was calm. You'll manage. There's always been more strength in you than you've chosen to use. You can't do this to us, he said, louder now, more desperate. This is my home too. No, I said quietly. It's mine. You lived in it, but you forgot to care for it. You forgot who built it. He went silent for a long time. I could hear him breathing, trying to find a word that would open me back up. But that door was gone. Please, he said finally, softer. You're all I've got. You should have remembered that sooner, I said. Then I hung up. The phone didn't ring again. I sat at the table until the sun reached the middle of the sky. The silence in the room was deep and clean. Not empty, alive like soil that has just been turned. Later that afternoon, Ellie came by carrying a covered pot and her old beagle waddling beside her. Chicken stew, she said. Made enough for two. I told her about the phone call. She listened without interrupting, her eyes soft but steady. When I finished, she said, sometimes justice sounds like cruelty when it first arrives. People will call you hard, Liberty. Let them. Hard things hold up houses. We ate the stew in companionable silence. Outside, the fog had lifted, leaving the air clear and blue. A line of birds traced the horizon like a sentence half-written. After Ellie left, I washed the bowls and dried them carefully. The smallest acts felt like prayer. Evening came quickly. I stepped outside again and walked the path to the small rise behind the house. From there, I could see the faint lights of the town. Somewhere beyond those lights was the house where Noah still lived, where he would soon begin packing. I didn't hate him. Hatred would have required more energy than I had. What I felt was closer to clarity, a steady, quiet certainty that this was what needed to happen. I sat on the damp grass and whispered, I'm not punishing you, Noah. I'm saving myself. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The land heard them, and that was enough. When I went back inside, I opened my notebook again and wrote, Day 1. I kept my promise to myself. The silence tonight is mine alone, and it doesn't scare me. I placed the pen down and blew out the lamp. The dark settled around me like a quilt. The house, faithful as ever, creaked once in response. It was the sound of something old learning how to rest. The next 4 days unfolded like pages that already knew how to turn themselves. Morning after morning, I woke to the same light creeping across the same floorboards, but each day the air felt thinner, lighter, as if some invisible weight were lifting away piece by piece. I didn't call Ruth. I didn't need to. The law was already walking on its own 2 feet, steady and silent. On the second day, I found myself sitting by the window longer than usual, watching the sparrows fight over crumbs on the porch rail. They were quick, darting, unashamed of hunger. I admired that. People pretend they're not hungry for forgiveness, for peace, for redemption. Birds just go after what they need. Ellie came over again that afternoon, pretending it was about lending me her shears. She didn't ask how I was managing, just handed me the shears and said, They're sharp, so watch your fingers. That was her way of saying, I'm here if you need me, but I trust you not to bleed. When evening came, I made a small meal of rice and beans and sat at the table without lighting the lamp. Through the window, I could see the moon rising over the field like a quiet witness. Felt good not to talk. Felt good not to explain. On the third day, Ruth called. They haven't filed any response, she said. That's a good sign. I expected as much, I said. There was a pause before she spoke again. You'll still feel it, Liberty. The moment it becomes real. Be ready for that. I told her I would, but I didn't yet understand what she meant. The morning of the 5th day came bright and windless. The air carried that strange stillness that happens before something changes. I spent the early hours cleaning the house again, sweeping the porch, wiping the counters, folding the blanket at the foot of my bed. It was the same ritual I had done for years in that other house, except this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I was waiting for something to end. At 10 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Deputy Keller. Ma'am, he said, we're on site now. They're leaving peacefully. No damage to the property so far. Thank you, I said quietly. You're sure? Yes, ma'am. Your son's packing a truck. They've taken most of their things. He said he'll leave the keys in the mailbox. I didn't ask what his voice had sounded like. I didn't ask if he looked angry or defeated or scared. I didn't want to know. "Thank you," I said again and hung up. I set the phone down carefully, as if it were something fragile. For a moment the whole house seemed to pause with me. The kettle hissed on the stove, a bird called outside, and all of it sounded very far away. Then it happened, the feeling Ruth had warned me about. Not relief, not victory, but something quieter and heavier. The body remembering that even freedom weighs something. My hands started to tremble. I sat down and let them. Tears came, not from guilt, not from sorrow, but from release. The kind of tears that come when your lungs remember what air is supposed to feel like. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath all those years. I cried until it was done. Then I laughed softly through the last of it. "That's enough," I whispered to myself. "That's enough now." Outside, the wind picked up, moving through the trees like a long sigh. I stepped onto the porch, and the sunlight wrapped itself around me like an old friend. Down the hill, the marigolds bent and straightened again in the wind. It was as if the world itself were taking a deep breath. A few hours later Ruth arrived. She didn't come to talk about papers or hearings. She brought a bottle of cider and 2 glasses, and we sat on the porch in companionable silence. When the bottle was half empty, she turned to me and said, "It's done, Liberty. The house is yours again. Officially, legally, and in every way that matters." I nodded. "I thought I'd feel more joy," I admitted. "But it's quieter than that." "It usually is," she said. "Justice doesn't make noise. It makes space." We clinked glasses. The cider was sweet, sharp, alive. It filled my mouth with something that felt like truth. As the afternoon waned, I walked Ruth to her car. Before getting in, she took my hands in hers and looked at me the way she had years ago in the hospital after a long night shift. "You know what comes next, don't you?" "I rebuild," I said. She smiled. "Yes. But not the house." When she drove off, I stood at the edge of the porch and watched the dust her tires kicked up fade into the horizon. The air smelled like fresh earth and new beginnings. I walked back inside and opened the small wooden box on the table. Inside were the 2 photographs I had found weeks ago, one of Thomas, one of me. I set them side by side, facing the same direction, and between them I placed the key from the house I had just reclaimed. I whispered, "We did it." Though I wasn't sure if I meant Thomas or myself. Maybe both. That night I didn't write in the notebook. There were no words left to chase. I simply sat by the open window, listening to the sound of crickets and the faraway hum of the highway. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked once and stopped. The silence that followed was perfect. For the first time in years, I felt the shape of my own life without anyone else's shadow on it. The house across town was empty now. The rooms that had held my silence were finally silent themselves. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. It is finished, I thought. And I am still here. The stars outside looked close enough to touch. The night smelled faintly of rain and marigolds. I sat there until sleep came for me gently, like forgiveness. I woke before sunrise and carried a chair to the front yard of the house in town. The grass glittered with dew and the porch boards were cool under my palms. The street was quiet in that way it always is after a storm of human voices. I set the chair beside the mailbox and rested a small wooden sign across my knees. The letters were still damp from last night's paint. I had traced them carefully, the way you trace a prayer that you want the world to hear without shouting. A safe house built by a woman once thrown out. I held the sign there for a long time, listening to the crickets end their choir and to a single bird begin the morning. The house stood behind me like an old friend with its hands on my shoulders. Then I rose, found the 2 pilot holes I had drilled, and screwed the sign to the post. When I stepped back, the white letters shone in the first low light. The words did not call attention. They simply asserted a fact. I walked through each room with a notebook and wrote what needed doing to make the place more than a structure. A roof holds out the weather. A home holds in the human parts. The kitchen needed a deeper clean and a new filter for the faucet. The bathroom needed a grab bar beside the tub and a rug that would not slip. The small bedroom needed a lamp whose switch could be found in the dark by a hand that shook. I wrote down 2 sets of sheets for each bed. I wrote down more bowls because soup happens often when people are beginning again. Before noon I called a nonprofit whose name Ellie had given me. Their director answered on the second ring. She sounded alert in that calm way that comes from listening to 1,000 stories, and helping each one find a safe landing. We arranged a visit for that afternoon. I scrubbed the counters, aired the rooms, and put clean towels on the beds. In the kitchen, I set out a basket with tea and instant coffee, and a jar of local honey. I sliced an apple very thin and arranged the pieces on a plate because the small neatness of that act has always told me that kindness can fit in the palm of a hand. At 2 o'clock, a small sedan pulled up. A woman stepped out with a clipboard and eyes that moved kindly across the world. She introduced herself as Mara and asked if we could walk the house together. We moved through the rooms slowly. She took notes without hurrying and touched door frames as if they were shoulders. "Who do you want to help?" she asked. "Women who have been told to go away," I said. "Women who were useful until they were inconvenient. Women who know how to keep a house alive and were told they had become furniture." Mara nodded like she had been expecting my answer. "We can place someone within a week," she said. "There is a waiting list." There is always a waiting list. When she reached the front door, she saw the sign and smiled in that painful way people do when a truth is both beautiful and too familiar. She asked about rent. I told her I wanted it to be a number that gave dignity without demanding apology. We settled on a small monthly amount, half of which would go back to her program. I asked for 3 things that were not money. No shouting in these rooms. No secrets that hide danger. And every person who stays must leave something better than she found it, even if it is only a clean spoon or a plant watered. Mara said yes to all 3. She shook my hand with both of hers and promised to call soon. The first call came 2 days later. "Her name is Mabel," Mara said. 70 years old. She has been sleeping in her car behind a laundromat on Grayson Street since her daughter moved her new boyfriend in and told her there was no more space. She has arthritis in her hands. She is kind with animals. She apologizes too much. "Bring her," I said. I arrived at the house early and opened every window. I made a pot of chicken soup and let it sit on low so the smell would reach the hallway before the door. I placed a vase of marigolds on the kitchen table. I put a folded sweater on the back of the chair because a person without a home is often cold long after the weather warms. Mara's car pulled to the curb. A thin woman with careful hair and clean shoes opened the passenger door and stood for a heartbeat with both hands on the roof as if asking permission from the sky. I went out and said her name. She looked up the way a deer lifts its head, ready to run and ready to rest. "You are Mabel. I am Liberty. This door opens for you." She smiled and put one hand to her mouth as if she needed to catch the sound before it escaped. Then she climbed the steps, step by careful step, and crossed the threshold as if she were stepping into warm water. I showed her the bedroom. I showed her the small shelf where she could set whatever part of her life she could not bear to put in a drawer. When we reached the kitchen, the soup greeted us. Her eyes filled. She did not speak. She did not need to. We ate at the table with the marigolds watching like kind judges. She told me that she used to keep a garden of peonies as big as dinner plates. She told me that her hands used to be a choir when she sewed. She told me that her daughter used to brush her hair for her when she was 5, and would lean into the brush like a cat. She stopped there. Sometimes a person's story knows where to pause without being told. When the bowl was empty, she asked if she could shower. I brought her 2 towels and a small bottle of lavender soap that had been a gift I never opened. She stayed in the bathroom a long time. When she came out, she wore a clean nightdress and looked like a woman whose bones had remembered that softness is not the same as weakness. Before I left, I set a tiny bell on the nightstand. "If you wake afraid, ring this and I will hear in my cottage." She shook her head. "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking," I said. "You are allowing me to be the neighbor I wanted when I needed one." She touched my arm. Her hand was small and sure. Then she lay down with her face turned toward the window and her eyes open. A half-minute later she was asleep. I locked the door behind me and leaned my back to it, listening to the house rearrange itself around the sound of a person who had stopped bracing for harm. It is a holy sound, that first sleep in safety. I walked home slowly, as if carrying something precious even though my hands were empty. On the rise behind the cottage the wind had dropped, and the afternoon had the hush of a library. I thought of Thomas and the carving on our porch that I had read with my fingers. "For our freedom." I whispered it now like a new motto. For our freedom, not just mine. That evening I wrote to Ruth and Ellie on 2 small cards. The first said we did not only win a house. We won a purpose. The second said, "Come meet Mabel." Bring your cobbler if you have fruit in time. Ellie arrived the next day with peaches and a grin and the beagle in a ribbon. Ruth came on her lunch break with paper napkins and news that 2 more women might need a place within the month. You will need a list, she said. You will need a rhythm. You will need boundaries that smile and refuse at the same time. I made the list that night. House rules written in my calmest hand. No shouting. No drinking that unthreads a person. Call out when leaving and when returning so the house can count its people. Everyone cooks once a week and washes dishes twice. Pray if you want. Sit in silence if you want. Music at a gentle volume. The front light stays on until the last person is safely home. The back porch is for tears and for laughter that cannot be contained. The kitchen is for mending. I tape the rules to the inside of a cabinet door. I do not know if rules can keep harm away, but they can give the heart a map when it is tired. 2 days later, Mara called again. Another woman. Her name was Teresa, 62. A bookkeeper until her hands began to tremble. Her son had sold her car and called it a kindness. She had not argued because some words trap you if you touch them. She arrived with a rolled blanket and a photograph of her mother in a blue dress. She looked around the kitchen and said the word home like a question. I answered it. That week became the first week. We cooked and we ate. We washed and we folded. We learned the shape of one another's footsteps in the hall. Mabel hummed hymns while she did dishes. Teresa wrote lists for fun and left them on the fridge like they were poems. I changed the filter and tightened the taps and fixed the rattle in the vent that had sounded like a small ghost. In the afternoons, I taught them the porch game Thomas made up years ago. You name 3 things you can see, 2 things you can hear, and 1 thing you are grateful for that does not fit in your pocket. We became good at this game. On Friday, a storm rolled in with wide shoulders. The sky turned the color of pewter. The house held. Lightning stitched the horizon. Thunder counted time. We stood at the window with our hands around mugs and watched the rain lay a clean sheet over the street. When it ended, the marigolds lifted their faces, stunned but pleased. Mabel laughed. Teresa said there is a smell for after. We agreed. That night, after the women had gone to their rooms, I took the key from the nail by the door and stepped outside. I crossed the yard and touched the sign on the mailbox to feel the letters through my fingers. A safe house built by a woman once thrown out. The paint was dry and smooth. The words felt true. I looked up at the windows. Soft light, 2 rooms. 2 women breathing. A house that had learned to listen again. I stood in the yard longer than I needed to, grateful for the way night can make a person feel held without being touched. Then I locked the door and walked home to the cottage with a tiredness that did not ache. I slept with the window cracked and dreamed of a porch swing that had finally found its hooks. In the dream I was rocking and the chains were quiet and the air was the kind that reminds you that morning will come whether or not you ask it to. I woke with the sun and the sense that the house across town had turned a page in its own book and written our names in the margin with a pencil. Not permanent yet, but present. I made coffee and stood at the sink with both hands around the cup. Then I whispered a small promise into the steam. I will keep the light on. I will make space. I will let mercy be the language. Word travels in a town that is still small enough to exchange recipes across fences. Within a week, the post office clerk knew to slide our mail to the front of the bin because we came early. The grocer started saving bruised apples and said they were perfect for sauce. The pastor of the chapel stopped by with 2 hymnals and an apology for not knowing sooner. I told him apology is only measured by what happens next, so he promised to send over a handyman who could fix the back step in exchange for a pie. Ellie volunteered the pie before he finished the sentence. The house settled into its rhythm. Morning smelled like coffee and oatmeal and clean breath. Afternoon smelled like soap and lemon. Evening smelled like whatever the heart had chosen and turned to steam. We ate together when we could and forgave each other when we could not. The beagle came twice a week with Ellie and patrolled the perimeter with the gravity of a general. We kept the front light as our little lighthouse. Sometimes a woman who had called earlier would arrive near midnight, a bag on her shoulder and her name held carefully in her mouth. We welcomed her with a chair and a cup and a quiet that did not accuse. Not everyone stayed. Some needed only a night of unafraid sleep. Some needed a week. The house made room by remembering that beds are for bodies and rooms are for stories, and that both move in and out according to needs that are not always visible. On a Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell rang while I was tightening the hinge on the pantry. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door to find a girl standing on the porch with a notebook in her hand. 17, maybe 18, with curious eyes and a backpack that had been mended 3 times at least. She introduced herself as Sarah. She lived down the lane and had heard we were a house that cared. I am supposed to write about a place that matters, she said. Could I sit and ask a few questions? I promised my teacher I would not be in the way. I told her to come in and sit at the far end of the table so the soup had room. She sat very straight and wrote the date at the top of her page like someone who respected beginnings. Then she looked up and asked the kind of question that comes from a good heart. What do you do when the hurt is from the people who are supposed to be your safe place? I did not answer right away. I set 3 bowls on the table and called to Mabel and Teresa. When they joined us, I repeated the question. Mabel touched her wrist and said, you move your safe place to where your body can breathe again. Teresa said, you put your name back on your own thoughts. I said, you build a house inside your chest that they cannot find, and then you build one outside your chest so others can rest too. Sarah wrote it all down and asked for seconds. When she left, she promised to bring a copy of her essay and her mother's recipe for cinnamon bread. The next morning, a loaf arrived on our porch with a note that said, love is a door you can reopen without losing face. We wrote the sentence on the fridge. Some days were simple. Sheets dried on the line. The city truck collected our recycling and waved with 2 hands. We planted herbs in a window box and felt very proud when Basil decided to live with us. Other days tilted. One evening a knock came that sounded like it was made by a person whose skin had become a drum. I opened the door and found a woman named June with rain in her hair though the sky was clear. She stood very still and asked if the rule about no secrets that hide danger meant she could tell the truth without being sent back. Does, I said. She told us a long story by short shapes. Each sentence took its coat off and set it on the back of the chair. By the end of it the chair was full of coats and she was lighter. We made up a bed in the small room at the end of the hall. I put the tiny bell on her nightstand. In the morning she made pancakes for everyone and cried into a tea towel when the batter bubbled, because it had been years since she had made something from start to finish without someone telling her the steps. Mercy does not erase what happened, I wrote in the maroon notebook that afternoon. It replaces the echo with a voice that speaks gently and keeps its promises. There were practical matters too. I met with a woman at the bank who explained how to set up a small account for the house, separate from my own. She wore earrings shaped like leaves and treated me with the dignity of a person conducting business, not charity. I asked the utility company to put a copy of the bill in my name, and a copy in the folder that Mara's office would also receive. Transparency is a kind of kindness. I learned to keep receipts in a box labeled with a word I had not needed in years. Operations. It made me laugh to be the operations manager of a house that ran on casseroles and the kind of love that does not perform. Twice that month I sat with Mabel on the porch and taught her how to call her own doctor without whispering. She practiced sentences like I need an appointment and I am not a burden and I will wait on hold, not disappear. The first time she said them into the receiver her voice shook, but when the nurse answered and put her on hold, she grinned at me like a child who had ridden a bicycle without hands for a whole block. Teresa handled the library cards and returned with 3 biographies and a murder mystery. We read in the evenings with our feet tucked under us and the lamp making one bright circle like a moon that preferred paper. I went back to the cottage many nights with the kind of tiredness that belongs to people who have earned it. On the rise behind my porch I sometimes felt the tug of old questions. Had I been enough as a mother? Could I have prevented the way Noah had drifted toward the hard waters? The wind answered with the honesty of trees. Love does what it can. Boundaries do what love cannot. Together they keep the roof on. One afternoon a letter came addressed in a hand I knew the way you know your own gate in the dark. I stood at the counter for a long time without opening it. When I did, the words were the kind you expect from a man who has run out of places to stand. He said he was sorry. He said his wife had left, that he slept on a futon in a friend's garage, that he had found a job unloading trucks and his back ached. He said he missed my cooking, my quiet laugh, my way of knowing when he was lying to himself. He asked if he could come by. Not to stay, just to talk. I sat very still and let the feelings pass through the body they belonged to. Then I folded the letter and set it under a stone on the porch rail. I would answer later, when my answer had cooled into wisdom. That night I recorded a few minutes on the old tape recorder I had brought from the cottage. I spoke to Lily without naming her. I said that forgiveness is not the same as access. I said that compassion is not the same as permission. I said that a boundary is a fence that keeps a garden alive, and that good fences have gates, but the owner holds the key. A week passed. June found a morning job at the bakery and came home with the smell of cinnamon in her hair. Mabel learned to hold a warm mug without apologizing for the tremor. Teresa started keeping a ledger for the house and showed me in tidy penciled lines how the small rent collected from each woman and the small portion we sent to Mara's program made a circle that sustained itself. I thought of Thomas's smooth stone from the river, and how he used to say that persistence can be kind. Our persistence was becoming a budget. On a Sunday afternoon when the air held that peculiar quiet that comes after church and before supper, I walked to the house with a tin of lemon cookies. The front light was on though the day still had its own. I stepped inside to find the three women sitting at the table with their heads bent over Sarah's essay. She had left it with a note. The title was The House That Listens. I read it slowly while the cookies cooled my hands. She had written about the porch rules and the lamp and the tiny bell and my sign on the mailbox. She had written that the house did not fix people. It gave them time to do their own fixing without being harmed while they worked. She called that mercy. She said mercy is time with the door locked against what breaks you. I stood there and felt the floor steady under my feet in a new way. Thomas had been right to carve the reason where I would find it. For our freedom. That sentence had grown into a whole building. When the women went to their rooms, I took a strip of paper and taped it above the kitchen clock. It said simply hold. Hold the roof. Hold the quiet. Hold each other without squeezing. Hold the line that keeps the house honest. 2 days later the pastor's handyman fixed the back step and Ellie's pie won the exchange. He whistled while he worked and told us the view from the top of the ladder was enough payment. I gave him a jar of our honey for being charming without cost. That evening Mara arrived with a donor who wanted to see what we had made. She was the kind of woman whose shoes never touch a puddle. I watched her eyes move around the room and find the sign above the clock and the bell on the nightstand and the ledger with Teresa's careful sums. She sat down like she had wanted to sit all day. She wrote a check without ceremony and asked what else we needed besides money. I told her books. Wood for the porch swing I intended to finish. And a sewing machine whose needle would not shred the world. She promised all three. On the last night of the month we made a supper that was almost grand. Meatloaf like remembering, green beans like summer held past its date, mashed potatoes that forgave everyone for being tired. We ate and laughed and listened to June tell the story of the bakery customer who asked for 6 bagels sliced thin, and then asked the clerk to butter every slice as if time were a dessert. After the dishes we stepped onto the porch. The night was warm and 1,000 crickets said their names at once. Fireflies rose from the grass and wrote their light in dots and pauses. We stood quietly under that grammar and let it teach us timing. I thought of the phone under the stone at my cottage. I thought of the voice I had not answered yet. I would. But not tonight. Tonight the house was full in the way a chest is full when the lungs remember their work. I felt Thomas beside me without needing proof. I felt Ruth down the road reviewing a case and being exactly the person the world requires. I felt Ellie washing her pie plate and humming badly on purpose. I felt Lily somewhere under a lamp doing math with a pencil and erasing gently. I said their names in my mouth like a rosary made of living people. I looked at the sign on the mailbox. The paint had settled. The letters kept their shape. I laid my hand over it the way a person lays a hand over a sleeping child. Then I turned back to the women and to the door that had held. We went inside together and left the porch light burning for a future we had decided to invite. Later, in my bed at the cottage, I opened the maroon notebook and wrote 3 lines. Mercy has a roof now. Mercy has a schedule and a stove and a ledger. Mercy knows how to hold a key. Then I closed the book and set it on the chair where I leave the things I want to remember in the morning. The window let in the night as if it trusted me. I slept without waking. When the sun found me, I knew with the clean certainty that comes after a right choice that the house across town had learned its new language. Could say welcome. It could say rest. It could say not here to harm. And it could say no when no was the word that kept the yes honest. Part of me wanted to run back and finish the porch swing before breakfast. I smiled at myself and let the urge pass. There would be time for swings and for letters and for the next woman who would knock and wait to see if Mercy would answer. And when it did, it would be because a house remembered the name Liberty and decided to live up to it. Morning came like a quiet confession. A thin mist floated above the grass, soft as smoke that had forgiven the match. From my porch I could see the house of Mercy breathing across the field. Curtains drawn, chimney still, a halo of sunlight on the roof. It looked nothing like the place I had reclaimed in anger. It looked like what comes after. I brewed coffee and sat with the maroon notebook open on my lap. The last entry written weeks ago ended mid-sentence. Mercy knows how to hold a key. I tapped the pen against the paper, then wrote, and went to hand it to someone else. That thought carried me through the morning. I walked the path toward the house, boots whispering through wet grass. Mabel was already on the porch knitting. Teresa was inside balancing the ledger. June hung sheets on the line, humming a song that climbed the air like prayer. "You're early," Mabel said without looking up. "I couldn't sleep," I answered. "Then you're exactly on time." She set her needles down, her fingers steady now, the tremor gone as if rest itself had been medicine. Inside, breakfast smells, toast, cinnamon, soap. The women moved easily around each other. No apology, no flinch. The rhythm of a house that had learned its music. I walked room to room, touching the walls like one touches an old friend's shoulder. The kitchen window was open, letting in the kind of light that erases years. On the sill sat a new pot of basil, small and bright. Someone had written on a tag, "For Liberty, so you don't forget you gave us roots." I didn't cry. I simply smiled the way a door does when it swings without squeaking. At 10, Ruth arrived with papers in a manila folder. "Routine," she said. "The nonprofit wants to formalize the partnership." We sat at the table while she explained clauses and clauses that meant continuity. "You'll still oversee it," she said. "But legally, the house will belong to the foundation." I looked out the window. Mabel was talking to a stray cat that had decided to adopt the steps. Teresa waved through the glass. "Let's sign," I said. It was never supposed to belong only to me. The pen moved easily. My name, once used to plead, now authorized mercy. Ruth placed her hand over mine after the last signature. "You know," she said, "the hardest part of healing is trusting the world with what you've mended." "I'm learning," I said. She smiled. "You're teaching." By afternoon, the women had planned a small gathering. Nothing grand, just tea and pie and chairs pulled close. Ellie arrived with the beagle and a dish that steamed under foil. The girl Sarah came too, notebook in hand, shy but brimming with questions. We sat in the yard beneath the maple tree. The breeze played with our hair. The beagle slept with his chin on my shoe. Someone started humming, and the rest followed until the air itself felt woven. Sarah finally asked, "What will happen when you're gone? When you can't watch the house anymore?" I thought about that. The answer came from the part of me that had already stepped into tomorrow. "Then the house will do what houses are meant to," I said. "It will remember the pattern of care. The walls know how to listen now. The floors know how to hold footsteps without fear. Someone will keep the light on. It doesn't need to be me." The girl nodded and wrote that down as if it were scripture. Evening settled slowly. The sky turned that shade of blue that feels like an inhale. The others went inside, but I stayed. Across the field, my old cottage waited in its usual stillness. I thought of Thomas then. Not the man who died too early, but the voice that had built these beginnings. For our freedom. He had carved it for me, but the hour had grown larger than either of us could have imagined. I walked home under a scatter of stars. The air smelled faintly of bread and rain. When I reached the porch, the candle I had left there months ago was still in its holder. The wax melted low. I lit it again. The flame rose without hesitation. Inside, the cottage looked smaller now but not empty. The chair, the desk, the smooth stone on the table. All witnesses that had seen me change shape without leaving my skin behind. I set the notebook down and pressed record on the small tape player. My voice filled the room softly, like smoke that decided to stay. "If you're hearing this," I said, "you found the house or the story or both. I built neither alone. If you ever forget your worth, stand by a window at dawn. Watch the light touch the floor. That's how forgiveness enters, quiet, consistent, uninvited, but never unwelcome. And when it does, let it stay." I clicked the recorder off. The silence afterward wasn't silence at all. It was breath, steady and whole. Outside, the porch light at the House of Mercy flickered once, then held steady. The field between us glowed faintly, as if the earth itself remembered how to guide travelers home. I closed my eyes and whispered the final truth that had taken me a lifetime to reach. Freedom is not escape. It is the calm you build and leave lit for others. The night deepened, but the light did not fade.